activist in the social movement. I was recently in the Labor Notes Conference in Chicago, meeting the West Virginia teachers and the teachers from Kentucky and Oklahoma who are going on strike. And I'm also going to talk to you later about the anti-war demonstration we're organizing this Sunday, which includes the demand for self-determination for Palestine and to end all U.S. aid to the state of Israel. So I think it's kind of connected.
Perfect.
And Blanca is also on the executive committee of the California Scholars for Academic Freedom, which Ahlam used to serve on as well.
She passed the ball to me.
Perfect. Well, Doctor, we're going to start with you. It was an excellent film. I was hoping to get maybe some background on the production of it. You were an executive producer, co-director of that. Tell us a little bit about that process and some other notes about the film that you would like to share with us.
Okay, good evening, everyone. And I'm going to try to be brief because I would like to hear from you all, if possible, because I really like the exchange. But let me first start by thanking Ahmed, the Ahmed program, and in particular, of course, Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi and Jacob and Berlin for all the efforts they put into making this event happen, actually. And to acknowledge that our existence tonight is very important as an anti-colonial endeavor, really, at knowledge and at resisting the imposition of colonial discourses on us, especially taking into consideration all the Zionist attacks that have been literally poured over Ahmed, and even until the panel, before this panel, we had some kind of Zionist infiltration. So just to acknowledge that this is a very important attempt, really, to decolonize knowledge. And since I mentioned that, and before I start talking about the process of the filmmaking, which is, of course, usually my favorite topic, in the previous panel, just to go back to Deir Yassin, because, of course, we know that it's the 70th anniversary of the most notorious massacre in the history of Palestine, which is the Deir Yassin Massacre. It's not necessarily the most notorious because it was the worst, but it was because of its impact. What I want to say is, in terms of decolonizing knowledge and resisting actually the imposition of the colonial discourse, I know that there is a conflict over the number killed, and the Deir Yassin segment in the film took me 8 months of fact checking. So I really went to every book. Me and Andy, of course, we could put our hands on. Which I want to acknowledge also Andy Trimlett. He couldn't be with us, but he's the director and co-producer. We interviewed as many Deir Yassin survivors as possible. I could tell you the story later on if I have time, how we actually found Atonement. And there are actually excellent references that were in Arabic that were never translated into English. I translated Sharif Kanani's book, who's a historian from Yazid. And Sharif Kanani actually was one of the first people to say the real number of the people killed in 1948 in Deir Yassin was about 109 to 110. Now, where does the number 250 or some say 220, etc., but the majority, of citations of number 250 come from, and actually it comes from the Etzel themselves, which is the collection of the Irgun and Stern gangs who attacked the village of Deir Yassin. And the reason, in the New York Times article you cited, it was based actually on a press conference with Etzel, where the Etzel fighters invited international media, including the New York Times, and they had a press conference over cookies and tea. And this is actually reported in the same article. They say, they talked and bragged about what they did in Deir Yassin over cookies and tea, which is similar, of course, to the testimony of Gihon, who was from the Haganah, not from Etzel, but he was a witness of the massacre afterwards. He said something similar. They were eating marmalade sandwiches, right? And they came up with that number, and it was a very intentional decision on the part of the Etzel leaders and commanders, because it was part of this systematic ethnic expulsion that was based on getting rid of many Palestinians as possible. So they wanted really to instill fear in Palestinians. Of course, it was a terrible massacre and they killed people. And Uthman Aqal, we interviewed in the film, himself, as a child of 11 years old, witnessed the brutal killings of at least, I think it was 12 or 14 people, I can't remember the exact number, because he was running from one place in the village to another, and everywhere he went, running away from killing, he found more brutal killings. So that's only one person witnessing that. So of course it was terrible and horrible, but in spite of that, of course, there was exaggeration of the number and the brutality of the killing. As I said, to instill, it was really a strategic plan, you know, to instill fear and get rid of as many Palestinians as possible. And after that, what is really interesting, then they started blaming the Arabs or the Palestinians for exaggerating the number. Actually, Yuski Menhias, who's their one commander in the film, who said we never, you know, force anyone to leave. In another you know, part of his interview, he says the genius, you know, mocking the genius Arab mind, you know, invented the exaggeration of the Deir Yassin Massacre, which is interesting because they actually started it and then they blamed it on the Arabs. Very genius plan for, you know, for a massacre. So I just wanted to clarify that. Hatem Kanana interviewed, and he tried really to have a kind of census of all the population in Deir Yassin. And he interviewed everybody he could interview from Deir Yassin and the descendants, and concluded that the number was probably 109 to 110 killed in Deir Yassin. That's, of course, not including the injured. So,
what was the total population of Deir Yassin?
I think it was around 900 people. So,
I wonder if
can we continue and then take the questions? I'm sorry if you don't mind. But we will have definitely open it up for questions. So now for the making of the film, this started as part of my research project in the refugee camps. And my original research project was on cognitive narratology and identity, collective identity of Palestinian refugees. And I started in 2006, actually, so it was more than 10 years. But then in 2007, I met Andy Trimlett, the director. And in 2008, when I wanted to go back and continue my research in Lebanon, because in 2006, the war, you know, Israel invaded, he approached me and he convinced me to work with him on a larger project of telling the story of 1948. And for him, as an average white American who had nothing to do with the conflict, he said that even after getting a master's degree in Middle Eastern studies, he still didn't get the conflict. You know, that's the point of being intractable, because the way it's presented in the media and the mainstream discourse in the United States is that it's an eternal conflict. It has been going on for thousands of years, that Muslims and Jews hate each other and they want to kill each other, etc. They don't really provide the historical context. This is a very contemporary, actually, conflict. And it is an expansion or an extension of the several European colonial projects in the region, etc. You know, so all of that lacks from any really meaningful discourse in the United States. And so he convinced me that this story has. Originally, I wanted to do a film only on the diaspora or the Nakba narratives, and do like a small-scale film, educational one that could be used in classes and communication or media classes, etc. But then he said, no, it's really better if we make it a larger scale. Now, we did not anticipate it would take us 10 years in the making. We thought probably 1 to 2 years, and that would be too long. But it's really an amazing project. The more we worked on it, the more we wanted to work on it and to get more and more. And it was so hard to stop, and we kind of forced ourselves at the end to stop, actually. But we have a lot of materials. So over 90 interviews, we used only 33 in the film. We have so much archival images that we haven't used, but only the ones we paid for, because those cost a fortune. All the military orders, all the archival materials that we still have. And that's going to be our next, project, which is, we kind of started a little bit cleaning the interviews, 12 of them actually, with the transcriptions, and posting them online as a historical record, and also for scholars and historians to look at that. Sorry, I took too long.
No, I commend you again. It was an incredible film. We're going to take questions at the end. but I want to shift quickly. David, this film obviously deals with the carrying out of the Zionist project. You had asked to speak briefly on that, and I want to turn it to you and share your thoughts on that.
Well, can you hear me? Okay.
Get the microphone. Can you get
Should I get closer? Okay. Yeah?
Is that better?
Yeah.
So I was going to talk about that, but after watching this movie and after hearing the first panel with Aurora and Dr. Rabab, I don't really have much to say. I mean, what I do think is really important about Zionism is to what Aurora said in the first panel, which is the stories that we internalize or the stories that we tell ourselves about the past determines our present. And people tell different stories about Zionism. And this is coming up on campus right now. You know, and the whole thing of President Wong saying he welcomes Zionists, and that raised, you know, I don't know how many of you saw this Golden Gate Express that came out last week, but which Rabab gave me. But they had a big article in there which has people from Hillel saying that, well, Zionism was just Jewish national self-determination was the phrase they used. And they think that, like, to say that Zionists are not welcome is wrong. It should be part of the discourse. And Dr. Abdulhadi is quoted as saying that it was a racist, Islamophobic, settler colonialist project, Zionism is. And the reality is that what Ali Ben from Hillel thinks, and what lots and lots of Jews think, including people in my own family, is that Israel was a necessary, like some of the people in the movie were quoted, you know, this was like an eternal dream that Jews could be safe somewhere. I had a great aunt, she's gone now, but she said that Zionism means that there should be some place in the world that's safe for Jews. And that's the narrative that they have about it, and they miss all this stuff. And, you know, I did come up in researching for this a bunch of good little quotes and facts you can use. What struck me was that, and you can see it even in 1948 in the movie, but now it's far worse, in my opinion, the way that being part of a project like that, a project to take away somebody's land and oppress them and drive them away, is going to twist you and bring your whole psychology down into the depths. I mean, and you see people like Defense Minister Lieberman over in Israel now saying that there are no innocent people in Gaza. There are no innocents in Gaza. Now, I think there are 800,000 children in Gaza, and yet there's no innocence there. And my cousin Ira told me that, I brought that up to him, he told me that he had a tour of Israel back in the 80s, and the tour was led by a retired IDF colonel who said that the only good Arab is a dead Arab. And this guy's leading tours. So this is what the narrative of which comes from 1,800 years of anti-Semitic oppression in Europe. It's a European narrative. Zionism is a European narrative. Anti-Semitism is a European thing. None of it was Arab. None of it was Muslim. And yet, how it's twisted and how it's now threatening to blow up the whole world. You see how Zionism is setting the world on fire, like we could see in Syria right now. So it's a big deal, and I'm really glad that I'm here to participate in this, even though I feel like I'm overpowered by all these amazing women who are doing all this amazing work. But thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Professor Greene, you had mentioned that you had seen the video earlier today in getting ready for research. Sorry, and so you prepared just some quick reactions, and just wanted to get those from you. Didn't mean to throw you on the spot like that.
That's okay. Yes, I saw it twice. The first time I felt less nauseous the second time than the first time. But I'm just gonna make a couple of very quick points. One thing, for what it's worth, not all Jews felt that nation state was the answer to the problems Jews were facing. So I just want to really just really just make sure that people know that that because it's so the film is so disturbing in so many ways. Another thing I just wanted to say, there is a history of anti-Zionism of Jews, anti-Zionist Jews, that needs to be lifted up, I think, in order to help with the situation that's going on now, because this genocide and sociocide is ongoing. It's not. The displacement of Palestinians, and everybody knows this. So I'm not saying anything that anybody here doesn't know, but it's still going on. And my very last point, from a kind of psychological point of view, is just the cycles of trauma that are being played out, and the way that victims sometimes, in order to cope with trauma, identify with their oppressor. And I think that's just one lens to look at when these people who are doing such horrible things and have had such horrible things done to them, and the ideas of intergenerational trauma, and that not everybody chooses to deal with trauma in that way. This is not at all to be making an excuse, but it's just a way to look at things, because some of these people, they're saying these horrible things and laughing, and it's like, what, and so it's just one of the ways, I think, to look at it is and then at the very end of the day, it just can't be allowed to go on. They all need, they just, in a way, not the understanding is not the answer. That's it just has to be stopped, and then that has to do with the larger issues of colonialism in the world and the political nature of what's going on in the world. I mean, there were boatloads of Holocaust survivors who were turned away from countries, and had nowhere to go, and so there was a kind of conspiracy of circumstance. So that's all I have.
Thank you. Dr. Abdulhadi?
So, yes, this is the second time or the third time I see the film. No, but it's actually every single time I learn new things about it, and I watch other things. So I'm going to actually just make a few points about the whole question of Zionism and the Zionist settler colonial project, echoing some of the stuff my colleagues have said, and also adding a little bit more maybe details. Oli Ben, the person that David mentioned, he is the executive director of Hillel in San Francisco, not at San Francisco State, and he's been described in the media wow. All right. Okay. So he's been described in the Zionist press as boots on the ground at San Francisco State. I mean, this is a description of war, and maybe we can have a little bit more discussion about it later, or maybe some other time. But in my statement criticizing President Wong for welcoming Zionists to campus, I said this is a declaration of war on Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians, and everybody who stands for justice, including sisters and brothers in the Jewish community who never ever agreed that what Israel stands for and what Israel says represents them. This is something that, and afterwards, some of you have heard earlier, there is a group on campus that was founded actually to contest President Wong's statement called Jews Against Zionism. Jewish Voice for Peace came out with a statement, Black Student Union, Black Resident Hall students, Black Business Association. I'm not talking about genuine Palestine students because everybody expects Palestinians to speak up. But I'm talking about broader contestation, including the Women and Gender Studies Department itself academically put on its website saying to President Wong, you cannot actually assume that. And after the Zionist organizations protested, President Wong came out. I was threatened by the provost actually to remove the unofficial Ahmed Facebook page, and otherwise I will be facing disciplinary measures. And I said, this is an official post, and I actually can speak for myself. I have the right to speak my own view, exactly the same way President Wong has the right to speak for. He doesn't speak for the whole university. He said that this would be a violation, what I said would be a violation of the values of San Francisco State. And this is very troubling because it means that San Francisco State stands for Zionism. So to me, I always raise the question of who owns Jewishness. I mean, this is a film, it's actually about Nakba, but it's mostly interviewing. It does interview a lot of Palestinians, and we know the Palestinian story because as Palestinians we know. But it's very revealing, the interviews with the members of the Palmach and the Haganah. And like, I think you only had one person who identified as Irgun.
Yeah,
Officially.
Well, in the interview,
Yeah.
actually,
Yeah.
more than that.
But it's even, this is the official. This is not even the most quote unquote extreme people who went to Deir Yassin, the Irgun and the Stern. This is actually the official people who became the Israeli army. So I think it's really important for us to keep emphasizing the question that historically there has never been a consensus among Jews around the question of Zionism. Historically, and I think it's really important for us to separate the question of how we address anti-Semitism as a form of racism and racial discrimination against Jews, that it is not acceptable anywhere, how to understand that and how to think about what do you do about anti-Semitism, and in what periods of history was there questions are against Jews, anti-Semitism against Jews, and in what periods of history there was actually pluralism, such as Andalusia, for example, where there was pluralism between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and people lived harmoniously with each other. So we need to kind of like think, where do the roots of anti-Semitism come in? And I think this is part of the whole political economy of it, that we also need to think about that. That continues, and also part of Zionism's success story in Palestine is because it was backed by colonial powers. Zionism would have never been able to succeed and exist in, and I think the other question is maybe we need to kind of like analytically and politically make a distinction between the Zionist tale that actually uses the Holocaust to justify the settler colonial project in Palestine, and the fact that the people who were victimized the Palestinians were not actually the survivors of the Holocaust. As Susan has said, that all the Western countries closed their doors to the Jews, and they could not allow Jews to come in. So then the only place for Jews was to go to Palestine, because Palestine was colonized by the British and it was open. And people who are escaping from tragedies, where would they go? I mean, they would go wherever it's possible for them to go. That's one of the other thing is that Zionism represents a particular interest of a particular slice of a particular part in history of the Jewish experience. So if we think about Arab Jews in particular, Jews who came from Iraq, Jews who came from Yemen, and the Jews who came from Iraq, their synagogues were bombed by the Mossad to force them to go to Israel. And they went to Israel, and the Jews in Yemen came, and then they were used all this Orientalist, colonialist terminology. El Shahat speaks about that a lot, that the Jews of Iraq came in what the operation was called Alibaba. Just, I mean, like 1001 nights. It's ridiculous. And the Yemeni is magic carpet. I mean, even, and the way when people came, when the Jews of Iraq and Yemen came to Israel, they were put in absorption centers and they were sprayed with DDT, because it was assumed by the Ashkenazi establishment that they were dirty. And this is the same thing, by the way, it was done to also the Ethiopian Jews that were supposed to have been rescued, but actually were kidnapped and were brought to Israel. The Yemeni story, it's very interesting because many of the kids, their mothers were told that they died, and they were taken from their parents and they were given up for adoption by the Ashkenazi establishment that thought that actually Yemeni, who were Arab, because you're not supposed to be Arab and Jew, you were Arab, are not fit to bring up the Jewish children, and they gave them into adoption to Ashkenazi. And this became a very big scandal that actually the Yemeni community has requested apology from the Israeli establishment. I think that the last point is the question of accountability. I think it's really, really important is that all these people in this film, they also, some of them show regret, some of them laugh about it, some of them is tea and cookies, some is kind of ha ha ha, it's funny. And you're talking about the fate of the people. I mean, you're talking about any human being who is injured, whether it's your foe or your ally, you should feel some kind of remorse about the loss of human life. It's a human life. But at the end of the day, even people who atone, is it enough for people to just feel guilty and say we feel guilty and we atone? Because at the end of the day, the land has been taken, People have been displaced, including this guy Azaria who killed Abdel Fattah Sharif in Hebron, right? And then he's going to be let go. The people who killed Muhammad Abu Khdair, who burned him alive. Is it enough for people to say, I am sorry? And then we say, this is brave, this is wonderful, this is courageous, this is great. And we think about the colonizers as maybe it's wonderful because they have been restored to their humanity by atoning, which they should have never done in the first place. They should not have committed these crimes in the first place. And is that enough? What happens to the victims? What justice is there for the victims even when members of the colonizers atone? What do we do about that? I mean, this is a very big collective question.
Can I just address this one because it's very important? Oh, sorry. But that's the point of atonement very quickly. Is it really atonement also?
Yeah.
I think that's the most important question, because if you take Hava Keller, who's the nice older lady who talks about the child and the shoes,
yeah.
If you really think critically about what happens next, it's very disturbing. So after she realizes the ugliness of the war, and it's a war of children and people, it's not a war of soldiers, all of that, what does she do? She goes to the Nakba and with a gun, and she actively expels Palestinians into Gaza, where she acknowledges they are still in Gaza today. So is it atonement? Yeah. Can you call it atonement? That's the question. Is it maybe just deep sense of regret and guilt?
But
maybe.
I'm not talking only about her. I'm actually talking about.
But I'm just giving her as an example. But most of them really, they didn't have any kind of atonement. The only one, just to be honest and for the historical record, is Ben Eliezer, who actually talks about his experience under the Nazis. He's the only one he noticed what he was engaged in, but he left Israel immediately after. And he actually gave up his Israeli citizenship, and Andy met him by coincidence in a conference organized by a Palestinian group and interviewed him. So he doesn't, probably that's the only person who really had real regret that mounted to action against those, atrocities. Sorry, Blanca.
Oh my God, yeah. Just want to make some brief comments. I like the movie because it is true that it's hard and disturbing to listen this Zionist consciousness, reflect on what happened. But at the same time, I do think that there is a contrast between the Zionist consciousness and ideology and the work of historically rooting, what happened, right? And one thing that becomes very interesting is, I remember I don't remember the name, but we said, there are two nations fighting for a land, and this is a brutal fight to see which one prevails. And so we win, or we want to kill them, and, it's normal. There is an understanding that this is a naturalized conception of two opposed, incompatible nations that have to fight for power, and one is going to be able to build a state, right, on the basis of dispossession, on the basis of violence, and once you build a state, it's normal that you want to keep your state, and then you can, so in their view, there is a naturalization of this cycle of violence. That comes at this, because this is an eternal thing, right? Because look, there are two people who are fighting for something. And I think what is very important about your movie or film is that there is, against this speech, side by side, we have an historical research that is showing that there is a material and historical origin to the project of Israel, right? And that then there is a way to have an exteriority to this discourse and think, well, maybe this problem has not always existed. Maybe there is an origin to this problem, and therefore maybe by coming back to the origin, we can find a solution. And when you were saying that this is a very contemporary question, the construction of the state of Israel, and we're naturalized to think that this is an eternal thing, I cannot but think about the situation of Algeria, right? Algeria was a colony of France in 1830, and it was in 1954 that the National Front for Liberation began questioning more than 120 years of French occupation and active population, right? Like they said 1 million French people live in Algeria. There were 7 million Muslims and there were 1 million French. And so for French people, that was the idea that they've been there forever. It was unquestionable, right? Now, today Algeria is Algeria. Today Algeria is not France. And it took an independence war to win it. And so history, right, it's also disputing these conceptions of what is there forever, what is not. It's very similar to history. Here we have a state that is even shorter than the colonial state of France in Algeria, and then we have all understood that it's always going to be there, by some kind of like pressure of the gods that it is going to be there, right? So I think to deconstruct this religious construction of a religious state, it's very important to break the reasoning, right, of Zionism. And I think it is important because we are fighting for a different conception of the world, where it's not that we have one nation fighting against another nation, one community fighting up against another community, but we would like to live in a society where we don't have a state repressing one, policing, deporting, mass incarcerating, killing in the streets. We would like to have a state that would be of a democratic nature, not the kinds of states we live in today, where we could live together in peace and harmony, like in Andalusia, in the country where I come from. And so this is very important because even in their own reasoning, right, like Zionism is a form of Jewish self-determination, which is, it's the first time, it's very recent, this reason. But I would say, what kind of form of self-determination is an emancipatory one if this self-determination requires the dispossession and oppression and displacement and murder of another people, right? Like what kind of conception of self-determination is a self-determination that requires the elimination of another, right? And so, because I'm a Marxist, I always go back to this very interesting and enlightening sentence of Marx when he was discussing the Irish problem in England, and he would say the English working class will never be free as long as it oppresses the Irish, right? So there's no movement for nationality of self-determination that could prove one really to be, right, a really emancipatory one if it's at the same time in the process of fighting for your freedom, you need to dispossess another people of their freedom. And so the last thing I would like to say is that usually we think about the question of Palestine as a dividing line. And it is true it's a dividing line, right? Because every spaces where we are spaces of political struggle, be it a university, talk about academic freedom for everybody, but for the Palestinians, right? We are in the international women's movement, like International Women's Strike Platform that began 2 years ago. And then we say we want to do the same thing they did in Argentina, they did in Brazil, they did in Spain, want to organize a mass strike of all women. And there's this platform that comes out and there's a Palestinian signing. And, say, it's fine that you fight for women, but can you throw under the bus a Palestinian person, right? The same in the anti-war movement. It is good that you're fighting against the wars, but don't bring up the economic aid of the US to Israel. You cannot touch Israel. So there's always a dividing line. Everywhere you go, but I think that aside of being a dividing line, I think that to think through all of these social conflicts from the perspective of Palestine is also an enlightening thing. Because it gives you the perspective of what it would mean to live in a world free of all forms of oppression. It is not only like the kind of line you need to hold, right, in the boxing, right, because it's exhausting to be having to fight for this line everywhere you go, to defend, stand in solidarity with it. But at the same time, this position allows you to have a vision that would be a vision of a new world, of a new society, because that line is also a productive line for a political project. Right? A political project free of oppression and exploitation. And with that, I want to leave you with 2 seconds of political propaganda, because I'm going to we have an anti-war demonstration coming this Sunday in Oakland, and it's it's a national initiative. There's going to be demonstrations in Chicago, Minneapolis, New York, and you will see that we have a set of demands here that go from no to all wars, close all the military bases, defend the environment, but there is a very important one I'm just going to read about. Bring all US troops home now, self-determination, not military intervention, hands off, US hands off the Middle East, Africa, Asia, Latin America, and US aid to apartheid Israel, self-determination for Palestine. The US cannot be the cause of the world. So I'm going to pass the flyers, and I hope you will come to the demonstration on Sunday in Oakland, and we can have the debate now.
So we're going to open it up to questions. But before we do that, Doctor, where can they go if they want to get more information about the film itself?
So we have a website, 1948movie.com. That we have the list of screenings and all the news. And we also have a Facebook page, like us, if you like the film, on Facebook. Search for 1948 Creation Catastrophe. I also have cards. If you can pick up one of my cards if you want to be added to our listserv.
Perfect, thank you. So what we're going to do is we're going to open it up to questions. The way that we want to do this is we want to have everyone be able to ask a question if they have one. So we ask, take your best shot, one question. In the past, when I've attended these, we've usually waited until all questions were asked, and then we proceed. So I encourage my colleagues on the panel to take notes. If you need paper and pen, please let me know now. So we're going to do that. I'm going to kind of find people as they raise their hands. We ask that you speak very loudly. Encourage you to stand if you are able. And again, because we do know that we have about 15, 20 minutes left, we do know that people will be leaving. Before you leave, the most important thing we do ask is if you did not receive a feedback form, to please grab one. If you did, fill it out, and then once you fill it out, turn it in. Okay? So with that, I am going to, yes.
Nobody leaves without doing the evaluation forms. We really need them. Evaluation forms.
Right.
We really need them.
So with that, I'm going to turn it to the floor. I believe you had a question, and then we're going to move on to the next question.
Okay, it's not a break. Yeah.
During your research about Deir Yassin, have you come to it was written by the representative of the Red Cross in Palestine? The name of the book was 1948 Palestine.
Yeah.
Were you able to find it?
Yeah, I know it. Should I answer?
I read this book. I read this book years ago. Okay. And then I went also to Google, and I Googled Deir Yassin. In both of them, they said that Deir Yassin people were slaughtered, not killed.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were slaughtered. Yeah.
And I did not actually argue that. I argued only the number. I said they were brutally killed. They killed in several means. I mean, one of them is throwing a child and his father in the bakery. So yes, I'm not contesting that. So she asked about a book written by the Red Cross representative at that time. We actually, it's on our bibliography. By the way, if you go to our website, we have the full bibliography of the film also.
I cannot find this book in the market.
Anyway, yes, I'll talk to you afterwards. So she's saying that in that book, the word slaughter is used instead of killing, which is, of course, to a great extent representative of what happened, but many people were actually shot. So it's a variety of methods of killing, and at the end of the day, it was terrible. So I just want to say, and even when we contest the number, I mean, does it really make it? Well, in certain contexts, the numbers make a difference, of course. But in this context, it's one of the elements or the factors, of this horrible event or massacre. But what is more terrible is how it was used strategically to expel and ethnically, drive out Palestinians, to use the fear tactics, against Palestinians. That's what I wanted to just clarify.
Yeah, I think also I wanted to just add something that actually is in the film. And a lot of the time people tend to gloss over it because in order to try to get support for Palestine, people tend to present Palestinians only as victims. But many Palestinians who were interviewed here and many Palestinians who lived through 48, actually people fought. People did resist. And the earlier film about Ain Hod, they were saying, every single time they put a fence around us, we tore it down. We tore it down. They came and attacked and we fought. The thing is that, of course, it was unequal power completely. And it's like, as it is today, it's unequal power. But I think if we perpetuate, we're now part of the production of knowledge, we're in a classroom, we're having these discussions. I think it is really important when we're talking about Palestine and everywhere else to be able to account where it is that people are actually protesting peacefully. It is, okay, like what's happening in Gaza. And when people actually did fight and defend themselves, including the story of Ahid Tamimi, that people are so try to play down the fact that she actually resisted the soldier who came to her house. It's not that she didn't go to his house. He came to her house, she defended herself. So I think even the representing and the representation of Palestinians too much as victims, as not people standing for themselves, it's also a story that is intended by the colonizers to convince the colonized not to struggle for their rights. This
Like
is a story,
African-American.
yeah, that's a story of subjugation, submission, and defeat. And this is the narrative that is perpetuated all the time. So I think it's also really important to be able to say that it's also for our intellectual honesty. I mean, just to be able to bring up these issues.
Okay, anyone else with a question? We have less than 15 minutes. Speak now. Yes, in the back. Stand up and speak up, please.
Say your name.
And your name.
Alex. I was wondering how, if anyone knew how often it was that people from displaced and survivors from displaced and Jews that survived from Europe would come and immediately take the homes of the empty homes of Palestinians that were just displaced. I remember in the movie that was something that happened. That right. I just want to know if that was something that was frequent and the history of that.
Perfect. We'll address that at the end. Does anybody else have a question before we address that?
We always present a problem, and not only here, but everywhere, and we don't present any solution. So we know all this, and it's happening, and there's no compassion. There's superpowers that are taking over, and we keep talking about it, and what's the solution? And I don't think awareness will create, and it will help a little, but it's not the solution.
Okay.
So always presenting a problem without the solution doesn't help us at all as Palestinians.
Yes, sir.
I don't have a question. I just have a compliment the movie because my father was 20 when he walked actually from Lod to Brazil. And I thought I know all the facts since I heard it from him, from my uncle. But watching this movie, really, as Dr. Rabab said, gave me a lot of inputs and details that I never heard before. Small details. And I think you have to watch the movie again to really appreciate it. So thank you very much. I think excellent job.
And I agree with him, and it will be nice if we make another movie, because you said you have more.
Well, 12 years. Well, it took 12 years.
No, they already collected the information, but we only presented part of what we collected.
No, she's right.
It will be nice if we will let people know.
Thank you very much.
A few other questions before we turn back to the panel to answer.
Going once, going twice, going three times.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Go for it. And then, of course, those questions are also open to the others, especially the first one. Alex, I'm not sure if I got your question exactly as you intended it, but you were asking about the process of Jews coming and replacing Palestinians. Was this like a normal occurrence? Yes, especially after World War II in particular, because there was, of course, more urgency. But it happened before, of course, but before it was slower and less systematic and less militarized, especially that the British were there. And at one point, actually, the British stopped Jewish immigration. And that's when...
reduced the number.
Kind of, yes, okay, reduce the numbers. Well, they were supposed to stop it, but infiltration still happened. And that's when actually especially the Greene and Stern turned their military operations against the British, and started targeting the British after the British did everything to help them. But as I said, after World War II, of course, and the closer to 1948, the more it happened. And as the Jewish militias were actually conquering towns, of course, it actually happened more and more often. Lid and Ramla in particular, and that goes to your point, is probably the most interesting case in Palestine because there is no doubt whatsoever, historical doubt about it. The facts are there, the military orders exist, and even the famous leaders of Israel, the co-founders, talk about it freely and explain that this is exactly what happened. A full expulsion of the whole population, not to leave anyone behind, of two of the largest cities in Palestine. And as you can see from the testimonies in the film, immediately they were replaced with at least 5 or 6 big ships coming from Europe.
From day to night,
Exactly. It's like the same, like within probably 24 hours. They just simply came and took they didn't ask, were there people living there? Whose houses are these? The food, the furniture, they took everything, literally. I mean, it was a big heist type of operation. Problem solution. So as filmmakers, I don't think it's our duty to provide solutions. I mean, I actually have to contest that. You have to understand that the reason we made this film is not for this kind of audience, like the more sophisticated, the people who know. It was really for average Americans who don't know anything or very little about the conflict. And it is an educational, scholarly project. And to go back to your point about accountability, historical accuracy was our #1 goal. I mean, we were not willing, under any circumstances, to really give up on historical accuracy. It was very, very important for us. And then now I'm going to take the chance and talk about Deir Yassin because that's my favorite story. So up until 2014, we didn't have any survivors of Deir Yassin. And very little material on Deir Yassin because no one actually from the Israelis, had any experience in Deir Yassin or witnessed Deir Yassin. So we decided not to include it in our rough cut. We simply didn't have any witnesses. So in 2014, and when Gaza happened, and we were actually demonstrating in San Diego on a weekly basis and in LA, I kept on seeing this old man with his wife coming all the time to the streets. And he for some reason grabbed my attention. Like I kept on looking at him like very old elderly people. His wife was very ill and he would bring a chair and seat her, but he would bring her. So the last time, when the truce happened and things seemed like to end a little bit, I said, I have to go and talk to him. So I went and I said, Ammo, marhaba, where are you from? And he said, I'm Palestinian. I said, yeah, but where from? Where are you from in Palestine? He said, Deir Yassin. And I said, like, Deir Yassin, the Deir Yassin? He said, yes. I said, were you alive in Deir Yassin during the massacre? And he said, yes, I was 8 years old. And I asked him, do you remember? And he said, yes, I remember everything. So I immediately, I couldn't resist. And that's after Andy and I said, no more interviewing. We have to finish this project. We have to move on. We did a fundraising, crowdsourcing type of project. And I had to do this. I told him about the film and I said, would you be willing to sit for an interview? We are doing this film. And he said, I would, but you probably better talk to my brother. He was 11 years old. He wrote 3 books, one of them on Deir Yassin. And I was like, what is your brother? And he said, Escondido. So those of you know, northeast of San Diego, down the road from me. So we did. I talked to Andy. I knew he would kill me, but I told him, we really have to do the story. And that took us back 8 months in the production. As I said, I translated Hatem Kanana's book from Arabic because Andy also needed to understand it. And then Andy thought, well, we have the Palestinian side. It would be great if we could get an Israeli to sit down and talk about, and you never know what they're going to say, but it was really worth trying. So he really came up, Andy was very meticulous, came up with a list of potential, people we could interview who were in Deir Yassin or at least witnessed something in Deir Yassin. And we narrowed it down to 3 names. And one of them was Gihon that you saw in the film. And one of those 3 said, couldn't talk anymore because he was very ill. One of them said, I wrote a book, go ahead and read it. I'm not talking about this, it's in my book, which we actually did, and they read his book. And then Gihon was the only one who agreed to sit down for an interview. Once he finished, we hired an Israeli fixer to do the interview for us. And once he finished with her, he said, "You're welcome to come and visit me again, but never ask me those questions. I don't want to talk about this anymore." I think, many of them actually did that. Many of the Israelis afterwards noticed what they have said, and they had this they freaked out towards the end of the interview. Some of them actually stopped the interviews, couldn't finish them. So we did, a whole segment on Deir Yassin. It was longer, we had to cut it. And regarding the details, and that goes back to the other question, the rough cut was 3 hours, then it was 2.5 hours. At one point we thought maybe a series, like episodes. And then we cut it down to 2 hours, and then we cut it down to 1 hour and a half, and then to 1 hour and 25 minutes to fit PBS, because that's, one of our goals is to broadcast it. We are trying, we submitted it, hopefully.
And last year I saw one exactly on PBS.
It's not ours though. It's probably something else. Anyway, so it's an educational project more than anything else, as I said. And you say we talk about this a lot, and we hear about, but that's really you and your environment. But average Americans have no clue. And I tested it on my students. I tested it on my colleagues. People with PhDs who work with me in the department. They were shocked. No clue, absolutely. They thought they were more, smarter, more intellectual, knew more than average people, and they had no clue. Literally, they didn't know. You see, the problem for Palestinians is taken for granted. But let me explain why for Americans it's different. This historical moment is the process of the ethnic expulsion and the replacement of one. People can't even imagine it. It's weird for them. Where did they come from? They must have been there for thousands of years. That's what they think. They don't really understand that. And this film was really meant for that. And regarding, just last thing, I talked too much, sorry. The detail, the next project and what to do with them. Yes, honestly, there's so much we could do with them. But as I said, first thing is to provide those important resources. The good news is we have the signed consent forms, Rabab, if you want to take this legally. We have the signed consent forms, so they can take those back. We already have, the consent. And we are going to start putting all of these. Eventually, we are also working on 1 hour version. So we have still to compress and to actually cut more materials and make it more concise. And one of them, this is top secret, because it happened today, this morning. Al Jazeera wants to Al Jazeera Global want to broadcast, but only 1 hour, not the 1 hour and 20. And I know what to cut.
So we have 1 minute, 2 minutes. So I want to open it up to any students that have any questions before. Yeah, go ahead. Yes, please. Closing remarks on the panel. If you can do it in person.
Actually, I do have a closing remark, because I found all these really interesting facts and I didn't get to use them. But anybody who has, you want to explain to the degree to which Zionism is a project of British colonialism, is that the first Zionist settlers arrived in 1898. They were funded by Lord Rothschild, Baron Rothschild. And you probably know this, but where did Baron Rothschild get his money? He got it from colonialism in India and places like that. So this is just a flat-out extension of the British colonialism has been going on for 200 years.
I just want to address Alex's question, just in case it wasn't totally clear, that it's still happening. Yeah. That Palestinian homes are still being confiscated, destroyed, moved into by Jewish settlers. It's ongoing, mostly from the United States. So, for example, there's 200,000 settlers, Jewish settlers now in Jerusalem. So, and it's house by house. So that's still happening.
And we see them in the American TV, how they go to the doors of the people, look at their door and pull them out and occupy. We see them here in America.
Just about the logic behind this. So earlier we had a Zionist person here, and here is the Arab armies, which I wish I actually invited him to stay and watch the film because we're interested.
Oh, I heard you talking to him.
Yeah. So you know what his logic was? At the beginning, I was, like genuinely trying to have a conversation with him, and then he said, "Well, Palestinians should have accepted the British division." And I said, "It wasn't the British." She said, "Oh, the United Nations." Like, why would they accept that? Would you accept someone to share your house just because they have the force and power to do so? And he said, "Well, if I get killed, yeah, probably I should do that." So I said, "You are just now basically surrendering to the logic of the powerful, that they could do anything and we have to accept it." Like, are you? But that's the logic that's still actually, to a great extent, the supremacy. Somebody mentioned, supremacy earlier, and that supremacist logic that, it's okay, we can justify it, and we could still use it, and it's the mainstream logic in Israel, unfortunately. I know there are some who helped us actually in the film, and I have acknowledged them. For example, Zohorod, or who called for the decolonization of knowledge on 1948. It's a very small Israeli, very progressive group, anti-Zionist, but the majority of the Israeli population is not, unfortunately.
Zohorot is almost done. Okay, but anyway, I just want to. Yeah. Well,
You want to go first?
I'll go first. Okay. First, I want, before I forget, because I want to thank the students. I want to thank Jacob. I want to thank Berlin. I want to thank Luis, who only came to bring the food and left. He came all the way. He lives very far, right?
Pittsburgh.
Yeah. And so he came, brought the food from his mother, and then he left. He went to another place. And so this is really great. And all the Ahmed miners who are actually without the support of the students and community, and everybody who volunteers their labor and comes, we won't be able to do this. I mean, this is really the people. Susan, who's actually teaching the course for us for very little money. Blanca, who's constantly supportive at the World Union. David, who's always on campus. I mean, this is people who are, Ahlam comes in and like, no transportation, no fee, no nothing, I mean, this is, and I think this is why it's really important. So I don't think people are aware. I don't think even our own people are aware. I have all this agreement about the average American or whatever, but that's another discussion.
Yeah.
But I think our own people, Palestinians, actually do not know all the details about what's going on in Palestine, how to frame things. Young people, this is why Palestinian students take these classes, because they also want to understand that if you are going to confront a very powerful narrative that's part of the status quo, you really need to know the facts, the figures, the analysis, the framing. It's really, really important. So I think the knowledge in itself is quite important. And this is why we are being attacked in the academy. If we were not doing something that's dangerous, actually, to the Zionist project and so on, they wouldn't do that. I do think that this stuff continues to happen. And I just want to mention that in Nakba, it's continuing to happen. Khiran is going to be most likely blown up on April 29th. It's happening in the Galilee. It's happening everywhere. Yeah, and it's happening every single place, everywhere. There is every day homes are being blown up, and the film earlier on. So I think it's really important that this is the Nakba continues. But I think we add, so is the resistance. Because one of the amazing things about the solution, maybe we don't know, 1 state, 2 states, 3 states, 100 states, no state. Okay, there's all the stuff that's being debated. The most important thing is that A, there is nothing on the table for the Palestinians in terms of political solution. But B, more importantly, is people are staying put. The reason we are able to tell these stories, the reason Ahlam can go and do this and becomes relevant is because Palestinians are refusing to leave. No matter what, they are staying put. They are the little kid and the older person are saying, we're not leaving. We're not going to abandon who we are. We're not going, this is a just cause. And the people of the world are coming and joining. And the rest, now the United States people are saying, okay, we're going to show the rest of the world. I mean, the world is, the human community is with the Palestinians. The US is not, historically. And I think this is really important to keep that in mind, that this is until something happens at the horizon, whatever, this is what we do. And that the Palestinian struggle is part of justice for all. It is not a separate thing. It's not Palestinians on their own fighting. We have people, exactly what Blanca was saying. We have the majority of the people with us. We would not be able to survive anywhere, including on this campus, if we don't have the support of people. We won't. It's very difficult to resist these very powerful forces. But if we come together and we are really unified, and I'm not saying that as a slogan, I'm saying as a practical thing, we are able to defeat all of this stuff on the basis of justice.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say something about what to do about it. I think your question, and you know, one of the things for me is that here in the United States, we're not in a neutral terrain. Not doing something is already taking a position, because the state is financing, the US state is financing the state of Israel, right? It's giving every year billions of dollars out of our paychecks, right? To finance the wars, in the occupation in Iraq and Afghanistan, to finance Guantanamo, to finance the military bases in Colombia, to finance the plan Mexico that is sending military training and guns, and to finance the state of Israel, right? So there is no place for neutrality. So I think, like we did in Vietnam, right? Not we, but the generation before, right? And Jaime did it, right? that the war in Vietnam was able to be stopped by a combination of things. On the one hand, there was a fierce military resistance of the Viet Cong, right? Of the people, right? And on the other hand, there was a mass mobilization of the people in this country, right? Who said enough is enough. And the coalition of these two things stopped the war, right? And I think that if we want to think of a solution for Palestine, we in the United States need also to take a position to say the minimum thing we could do is to sever all the ties our government has with the state of Israel, so it will be up to the people living in Palestine and all the refugees to decide what is their faith. Because right now they cannot say what they want to do. Why? Because you have foreign powers that are arming and giving guns to the state to continue the occupation, continue the dispossession. So in the name of self-determination of nations, and that every people should have the right to decide their own future, we should argue their own states, right? Stops financing a project without discussing with, I have not voted to every time I go to work, right? I'm very traumatized of the idea that out of my paycheck, I am financing a war and a colonial state. I have not had a say. I'm fine paying taxes for education, for healthcare. I wish we had single-payer healthcare in this country, you know. But there is a part of the financing of this society that is not democratically discussed. So I do think that even to do a democratic campaign is saying, like, could we have a referendum to discuss how do we use our money? Because maybe we don't want to use our money to have 50% of the federal budget is in military and foreign aid. 50% of the federal budget. People don't know about these things either, right? And when you would say that in a classroom, I mean, I think here in San Francisco State, we're again short of a budget, but because we are cutting classes. So like it would be very good to say, maybe we want to reinvest this money to finance the Ahmed program and give the 2 10-year lines that were promised to Professor Abdulhadi when she was brought to this university. I would prefer that my paycheck goes to that, right? Than it goes to the wars. So the second thing, I think in academia, and this is going back to what you're saying, there is a big movement that is growing for the boycott and the divestment of Israel, which is the academic boycott and the cultural boycott. And this is an ideological war very strong happening because we want the academic organizations of this country to say we do not condone politically, ideologically what this state does. Maybe we cannot yet control what the US state is doing because we are deprived to have a democratic voice in this country, how our taxes are used. But at least we want to say publicly that we do not agree and we will not go to a state that behaves this way. And this is an ongoing fight, right? The MLA, Modern Language Association, where I belong, tried to have a discussion on BDS, and the discussion was shut down by the executive committee to prevent the delegates to have a discussion because they are terrified that every time we have a discussion and we have an educational campaign and we put a vote, we win. Every time we hear the arguments, we watch the movies, we read the books, we spend 20, 50, 2 hours, 1 week thinking about it and learning. There is no question here. There is no question that we don't want to have to do anything with that. If we have a minimum of moral consciousness, we do not want to be associated to the history of a colonial state that has grown out of violence and continues to reproduce violence. So I do think that there are solutions that are both linked to the academic field, but also to the mass mobilization. And if I came to to speak and to invite you to this modest anti-war protest is just because some of us are trying to bring back mass mobilization, right? Because that's what has proved to work in this country. That ended the war in Vietnam. That could end the US aid to Israel and to bring back all the troops home and close all the foreign bases, right?
Perfect. One final.
Okay, I was given one final point. Thank you, Blanca. So to build on your what you said is it's a collective work really that we should be mobilizing for. And when we say collective, everything matters, everything adds up to whatever you could do in your capacity, in your environment. So for me, years and years of being a scholar of media studies and doing critique of the media, critique of representations of Muslims, Arabs, and especially Palestinians. And I reached a point where I said, well, now I could actually probably produce knowledge instead of just critiquing it. So take an active part in changing the narrative, not only critiquing it. Critique is very important, of course. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. And I'm still engaged in doing that kind of research and keep on critiquing it. But at the same time, you know, to produce knowledge, although unfortunately sometimes you perceive resistance from the community itself, but to insist to do whatever you could from your environment, what you could do, what you understand to do. And just to close about the film. So this film is a non-profit project. Neither Andy nor I could make any money out of the film. All of the money generated, which is not too much, but anyway, any money generated from the film goes to a special pot actually to create more social justice oriented films. So that's the idea, is to keep generating, like take the revenue that was really collated from about 600 sponsors. We did a lot of crowdsourcing and take that money and put it towards more knowledge production. I just wanted to end with this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. We again would like to ask that you turn in the response forms, the evaluation forms. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everyone again for coming, and we will see you next time. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I can take it. I'll wait for the thank you.
Where's your home?
Yeah, let's not separate. Let's keep them separate because the other one is.
Yes. Thank you.
You know where most of our
We only have.
Thank you for whatever you said. Well said. And good luck.
Oh, yeah, that's Wednesday. So yeah, I was a student in the program. I received that from my so, I mean, my personal history, so like, right, I've grown up in this very
يا بس المسلم يعني مسلم عربي ولا مسلم افغانستان ولا مسلم يعني
Hi, Ahmed program. Oh, لا يمكن هم beyond يمكن تركيا يمكن beyond just العرب. I mean the whole idea. I know what
It's about Islamophobia. Is it about the Islamophobia?
no, to avoid using the Middle East because it's a colonial term.
But Muslim, like نحن ما دخلنا شيء باندونيسيا واندونيسيا نصها كلياتها اسلام.
Yeah, but هدول أوسع من بس. Yeah. Again, the whole idea is to avoid using the Middle East. لأنه the Middle East is a colonial term. بس يعني طبعا تحكوا مع رباب لأنه هذا مش really not my center يعني.
نبرز تسمعي بالدكتورة ياسمين زهران الله يرحمها بتوفت الماضي كانت باليونسكو تشتغل كانت دايما تقول لي كلمة فلسطين
For some reason your voice is so loud here. Maybe you should turn this off.
You didn't like what I said?
No, it's just I can't hear.
Does that work better?
Sorry.
فلسطين it is the kiss of death.
أنا
الأمريكي يحكي بفلسطين بالحكومة
كنت بتعرفي رباب عبدالهادي إنه they are suing him. فأنا كان very important إني أجي يعني شخصيا support him. Yeah, she's being sued by the law firm, which is one of the branches of the lobby. بسبب شغلها بسبب عامل يعني she's being called. She's doing a beautiful job. Yeah, أنا I was being called terrorism whitewasher.